Okay, so let's delve into the details now about this study. And again, we'll talk about some key terms and concepts as we're talking about this. I was actually able to track down the original report, so the original article that led to that claim that was made in the commercial. And it turns out that it was published in 2002 in a veterinary medicine journal. And I read the article, and one thing that surprised me was that the subjects were all Labrador retrievers. So we aren't told anything in the commercial about how only Labrador retrievers were part of the study, that maybe the conclusions only apply to Labrador retrievers. It's possible certainly other dogs might have reacted differently. We don't really know based on this. But that was one little interesting tidbit. So the subjects were 48 Labrador retrievers. And they took these retrievers, and half of them were assigned to receive one particular diet. The other half were receiving another diet. And I believe that the retrievers were coming from the same litters. So they basically had like one litter, and they would take one dog from that litter who would get the standard diet, another dog who would get the other diet. So this was a way of trying to control for possible genetic factors as a lurking variable. The study doesn't specify what type of food these animals were given. So nowhere in the article does it say this particular group was fed Purina dog chow or Purina puppy chow and then dog chow, and this group was fed this other thing. We see, though, however, that the study was conducted by Purina. Purina Laboratories conducted the study, so the assumption is that Purina dog chow and puppy chow were a part of the study in some way, but that wasn't made explicit. Another thing that was kind of interesting, so the title of the article was Effects of Diet Restriction on Lifespan and Age-Related Changes in Dogs. So if you actually read the details of the study and what was done, it sounds like they didn't necessarily compare Purina dog chow to another brand, but what they were looking at is some dogs could eat as much as they wanted, and others were restricted in terms of how much they ate. So I think that all of the dogs were eating the same thing, but it was just how much they were eating that was coming into play. So the dogs who had the restricted diet, who couldn't eat as much, they ended up living longer than the dogs who could eat as much as they wanted. So it wasn't what they were eating, but it was how much they were eating. And again, that's not really something that's made very clear to us when we're watching the commercial and they're telling us that they've proven that Purina dog chow is going to help your dog live longer. So again, this is kind of what I just said. The real conclusion from the study is that lean-fed dogs lived longer than the dogs who could eat all that they wanted, which makes some sense. You know, if your dog is eating too much and it's overweight, that could lead to other types of health problems and perhaps not as long of a life. So again, this is why I always say that, you know, we want to take certain things that we're reading and hearing about with a grain of salt, because when we go and actually find the actual details and learn a little bit more about what actually happened, it might not be what we're told happened, or there might be really important details that are being left out that are going to help us more carefully interpret the conclusions and make decisions based on those conclusions. But let's talk about this now in terms of some of the concepts that we've just learned about. Let's try to apply those concepts to this situation. So let's say researchers believe the type of dog food affects the lifespan of a dog. So type of dog food would be what? Which variable? And lifespan would be which variable? So we believe one variable affects another. So what we believe has an impact would be our explanatory variable, and what we believe has, or what the outcome of the study is, would be our response variable. If the amount of food given is not controlled for, what type of variable would this be? So we think we're mostly interested in type of food, not really the amount of food. We would hope amount of food would be controlled for. But if there's something else that could be going on that could affect our response that we're not controlling for, remember, we'd call that a lurking variable. And one thing that chapters 5 and 6 talk about is this idea of confounding. So this has to do with, again, how the lurking variable is coming into play and what it's doing. So when you hear that term confounding, what does that mean? So if we have a lurking variable that we haven't controlled for, we say that we could have confounding. So two variables are confounded when their effects on a response variable cannot be distinguished from each other. So the confounded variables may be either explanatory variables or lurking variables. So what that means is that maybe you have two explanatory variables and you can't really distinguish which one is actually leading to the response. Or maybe you have an explanatory variable and a lurking variable, and again, you don't really know what's affecting the response because you haven't done a very good job of controlling for the lurking variable. So confounding has to do with how a lurking variable is coming into play and how it's affecting the response. And ideally, again, we want to try to control for those lurking variables. The great thing about random assignment is that you can mix those lurking variables up at the start of the study. And this means that you can certainly have groups that are similar in terms of lurking variables that you've thought about ahead of time. And you can also have the groups be similar in terms of lurking variables that maybe you haven't thought about, that you have no idea are even possible things that could affect the response. So ideally mixing things up so that each group start out on the same level playing field in terms of those lurking variables. And the only thing that is different between the groups or among the groups is the treatment. That's going to give us a clearer way of seeing whether it's actually the treatment that's affecting the response rather than these other things that have not been controlled for. And so in this particular example with the dog food, we're maybe interested in type of food, how type of food is affecting the response. But if we're not controlling the amount of food, then we would have what's called confounding. Type of food and amount of food would end up being confounded, and it wouldn't be possible then to determine what's leading to this effect, what's leading to this response of a longer lifespan. Is it the type of food? Is it the amount? Is it both of them? Is it other things that maybe we haven't controlled for? So again, keep in mind this idea of confounding. We also want you to think about another new idea, a new term that you're reading about in chapters 5 and 6. This is called statistical significance. This is something we're going to talk about in a lot more detail later on this semester. Right now, we just want you to know the general definition of what statistical significance is. If you see a media report or a journal article and they talk about how the results were statistically significant or they were significant, we want you to know what that means. So this is just a little blurb again from the dog food study. Compared with control dogs, food-restricted dogs weighed less and had lower body fat content, lower serum triglycerides, triiodothyronine, hopefully I said that right, insulin and glucose concentrations. Median lifespan was significantly longer for dogs in which food was restricted. So they use this word significantly. So when you see significant within a statistical context, it has a particular meaning. And I should have mentioned that the control dogs here were basically the dogs who could just eat whatever they want, how much they wanted. So we were comparing those against the lean-fed dogs. What does significantly mean? What does statistical significance mean? So if we say results are statistically significant, what exactly does that mean? So the formal definition of statistical significance is that a result is statistically significant if we obtain a result that would rarely occur by chance alone. So it's unlikely that chance alone is responsible for the findings. It's unlikely we would see this just by chance. What does just by chance mean? Well, it sort of means just because, just naturally. It's possible that just naturally dogs given one particular food or who are fed a particular way are going to live longer than dogs who are fed another particular way. That just naturally might happen. Just by chance, we would maybe expect that to happen. It's not really that big of a deal. If it's very unlikely, or if it's unlikely that chance is the explanation, then we call the result statistically significant. If there's a small possibility that we would see this thing happening just by chance alone, we call the result statistically significant. And you might now be asking, well, how do we determine that? Is there a way to measure that? And there are some ways we can determine that, and that's what we'll talk about more specifically later on. But right now, we just want you to have a sense of the definition. It's unlikely that chance alone is an explanation. That's what statistical significance is. If it's very likely that these results would happen just by chance, then we would say the results are not statistically significant. We also want you to kind of have a general understanding right now about the fact that this is not the same as something that's called practical significance or practical importance. And I wanted to kind of quickly try to illustrate that by going back to an example that we talked about a little bit earlier. So you might remember I was telling you about this survey I got in the mail from Gallup, and they sent me $1. And I mentioned that Gallup does these particular studies where they try to see if certain incentives are going to affect whether people respond and complete the survey. So remember, they did this particular study, and what they found was that getting an incentive certainly helped. So those who got some kind of incentive, whether it was prepaid or postpaid, responded at a significantly higher rate than those who got no incentives. So the difference between these two groups and this third group, those were statistically significant. It's unlikely that we would have seen those differences just by chance alone. But when you look at the difference between prepaid and postpaid, the results were not statistically significant. So you might remember I told you that, I mentioned it down here. So 19% responded when they got the gift card right away. 20% responded when they were promised to get the gift card after completing the survey. Okay, so no statistical significance between these two groups, but we might argue that the results are practically significant, at least for Gallup. So why? So practical significance has to do with the implications of the findings. Are the findings important? Will anyone care about them? So just because something is or is not statistically significant, that doesn't mean that anyone's really going to care or that it should lead to certain changes in how we behave. And much later on, I'm hoping that you're going to see why that's the case. It's actually pretty easy to get statistical significance, but that doesn't mean that the results are practically important. And here I just want you to think about the fact that, okay, there's not that big of a difference here, but that doesn't mean Gallup should say, well, we could do really either one and it's not going to make a difference. Remember I told you there were 5,000 people, there were 1,000 people in each of these two incentive groups. So in the prepaid case, Gallup ended up spending $5,000 to send out all of these gift cards, and only 19% responded, so Gallup lost a lot of money there. Now imagine here, if they're only going to be giving out the gift cards if people respond, and 20% responded, well, they only had to end up spending $1,000 here. So I'm hoping that makes sense. So Gallup had to spend a lot more money here and wasted a lot of money because there were a lot of people who didn't really seem to care that they got a gift card. That didn't affect whether they responded to the survey. If they're only sending out, or if they're only paying for those who return the surveys, then they're not out as much money. And for them, that might be practically important, that they don't have to spend as much money. They're not losing as much money. So always be thinking about that. So just because you read the results were statistically significant, that's not the only thing we want to be thinking about. That's not the end of the story. We also want to be thinking about practical importance. That's equally as important and maybe even more important. And again, later on, we'll talk more specifically about these things. For now, we just want you to understand these basic definitions. Okay, so we're going to come back and then we're going to talk more about different kinds of experimental designs and some other important terms and ideas that you're reading about. So we'll be right back.